Coming through. Okay, great. Okay, we want to get right into this panel, but I want to set the tone a little bit. The last did set the tone. We started talking about the role of the federal government and what the federal government can do, what the Crown can do. That's essentially the essence of what this panel is about. The three gentlemen that are sitting up with me today, I apologize, there's no women on this panel, but we've got three gentlemen. Bob Rae, who was the 21st Premier of Ontario. He was the interim Liberal leader, and he's now teaching at the University of Toronto. Morley Gugu is the regional chief of the Assembly First Nations for Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. A good friend, somebody whose portfolio included dealing with education, and his nation has been doing some incredible work, Mi'kmaq Nation, in terms of education. And Buddy, or Miles Richardson, I don't know if you were the youngest at the time, president of the Haida Nation for years. At the time, and was on the task force that set up that made the recommendations that led to the creation of the BC treaty making process, and was on the treaty commission, and was also the chair there, and is involved in University of Victoria on some really interesting University of Victoria on some very interesting governance work. I forgot to mention Morley was also, I think you was the youngest chief in your community. You were chief for 19 years or more, or 20 years now, something like that. Okay, so moving on, that's the panel. You can read their bios more in the paper. I want to read you something very quickly before we get going to set the tone for our speakers. This comes from the Chilcotin Nation decision from Vickers, and it says, and he was talking about the relationship between the different Indian Act bands and the Chilcotin before he was deciding if there's Aboriginal title. And Vickers said, the setting aside of reserves and the establishment of bands was a convenience of government to government at both levels. The creation of bands did not alter the true identity of the people. Their true identity lies in their Chilcotin lineage, their shared language, customs, traditions, and historical experiences. While band-level organization may have meaning to a Canadian federal bureaucracy, it is without any meaning in the resolution of Aboriginal title and rights for the Chilcotin people. So kind of building on what people have said. I want to read you something that the Royal Commission said back in 1996, and the recommendations of the Royal Commission are as relevant today as they were back then. Aboriginal peoples are entitled to identify their own national units for purposes of exercising the right of self-determination. It doesn't have to be recognized as such by the federal government or by the provincial governments. Nevertheless, as a practical matter, unless the Canadian governments are prepared to acknowledge the existence of Aboriginal nations and to negotiate with them, such nations may find it difficult to exercise their rights effectively. Therefore, in practice, there is a need for the federal and provincial governments actively to acknowledge the existence of the various Aboriginal nations in Canada. And then the United Nations Declaration, which, contrary to some people's opinion, has been endorsed fully by the Government of Canada. I know for a fact that it has been, but there is a section of the United Nations Declaration that we need to think about when we're talking in this panel, and that is Article 38, which says states, which in our case is the federal government and also the crowns in right of the provinces, states in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples shall take the appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration. So my question to the panel is, what should the state of Canada do? And we'll start with Buddy.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. And I ask for the participants' indulgence again. I never intended to talk so much at this session. I thought I was going to open it and close it and thank you all. And anyway, Tim asked me to participate. Tim asked me. Tim asked me to help with this panel, and I'm happy to. I'm gonna end off with a bit of experience from the Haida Nation on asserting our nationhood and the role of Canada in that, and just for illustrative purposes. But let me start off by addressing that point you brought up, Lee, earlier, of what's our takeaway from here? What do we want to accomplish from this 2 days of discussion? If I was to answer that, I'd say we'd really do well, I think, to persuade or coax or convince or knock over the head, however we do it, the Government of Canada to formalize their commitment to nation as a departure point from the failed colonial experience, which has been underway for the last 150 years through the Indian Act. On behalf of the people of Canada, as the government of Canada, to formally say we've been down that road, it's a wrong road, we don't like it. Now we're committing to a nation-to-nation relationship and back that up with a formal proclamation backed up by legislation so that all their negotiators, all their officials out in the field need to follow it. And in the transition, have Indian, you're not going to get rid of Indian affairs overnight, I don't think. There's going to be some who want to hang on to it for a while, and that's just the way it is. But recede through the choice of each First Nation. Have them get the hell out of the way. Move into the background as First Nations assume their nationhood and their lawmaking authority, and just recede into the background. I had a so that what I think would be a really good takeaway. And as the Tsuut'ina counselor just said to me, we should get together in a year, wherever it is, even if it's in our regions, and compare notes, see how much progress we've made, keep each other accountable. This is a tough undertaking, but it's exactly the right thing to do, and I think we have the brain power and the commitment to do that. We've had ministers, we've had officials, we have people who work in First Nations. We need to get at it, but it's going to take commitment and elbow grease. The other lady earlier talked about the government might change in 3 years. Are we going to lose everything? Are we going to be all talking for nothing? One thing I'd say to that is it's really important, and we got to look at this nation-to-nation commitment and implementation as nonpartisan on political terms. If somebody does something, specifically a government, federal or provincial, and the provincial governments have done a lot over the years toward this, and if they do something positive that helps you, say so. Stand up and support them. Say it's the right thing. My experience is when I was chief commissioner of the BC Treaty Commission. It was the late 80s, early 90s. There was a new as chief commissioner of the Treaty Commission, we relate with the Minister of Indian Affairs, the provincial minister in BC, and the First Nations Summit as the principals. So we talked every week. We talked amongst that group to keep the process moving forward. So the new minister comes to me as chief commissioner. He says, Mr. Richardson, I'm a new minister, a good minister, in their time does 2 or 3 pieces of legislation. You got any ideas for me? Said, thank you for that question. Here you are negotiating treaties in British Columbia, and at the same time you're shoveling out the Indian Affairs budget to all these 200 and something communities, which are the colonial system, that are at odds with treaty making. How the hell do you square that as minister? He says, what should you do? I said, what you should do is recognize each of our First Nations as we see ourselves in British Columbia, negotiate financing agreements with them, make sure that the accountability is not to you as the minister in Ottawa, but to the First Nations leadership in their nations. And you work out nation-to-nation accountability criteria for that. To his credit, he went forward and drafted the legislation, introduced it, and all hell broke loose. His consultation wasn't perfect. There was all kinds of reasons to go against it. It never passed. So now we still got Harold Calla flying back and forth across the country every week trying to fix it. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step that was in my view, was worthy of support. Accountability in our nations. Accountability to our people, not to the minister in Ottawa. So anyway, if steps like this, even small steps, come forward, support them. I mean, this is serious business. Change takes effort. Change takes work. Just generally, what's the role, before I get into the Haida example, of the federal government? Number one, and really importantly, I think the federal government must articulate the policy of Canada in their relationship to Indigenous people. That's really important. You can't wait for polling. You can't wait to have the courts flesh it out in detail. Somebody has to make a political choice and articulate what the policy of in relations between the state of Canada and Indigenous people is. Nation to nation is a heck of a good beginning as a departure from the Indian Act and colonialism. Get out there, make a proclamation. This should be done in the next year. It should be done in the next few weeks. Make a proclamation on that new relationship and back it up by legislation. So those self-government negotiators, when they go to each of the tables around this country, have a clear mandate and resourcing to implement that. That's the only thing that's going to cause change. If we just go on and without that big statement, without that big commitment, I can't see much is going to change in the next year. So it takes that leadership. Secondly, and really importantly, the government of Canada and the government of the provinces must follow the direction of the courts. The courts aren't the end of the road. The courts clarify the law in Canada. Those decisions need to be implemented by the respective authorities, federally and provincially. We'll get to the point where we as Indigenous governments are implementing those decisions under our own unilateral authority, under our own inherent authority. And some of us have done that over the years with different degrees of success. But if the Crown continues to drag its feet on implementing these decisions, we're going to have no choice but to go out and implement them themselves. Maryland, I hope you don't mind me saying this, because Maryland, the Heiltsuk Nation, won a major Supreme Court victory in 1996 about their right to sell herring spawn on kelp. 1996. They still haven't resolved. Canada has not resolved in negotiations. What kind of country, what kind of place is this? I mean, we got to do better than that. And that's the second way. The government of Canada must live up to the direction of their courts. That's their role. That's their job. That's why they have that legislative authority. And if they continue to vacate that, we've got to assume it. Third, and really importantly, this is where the rubber hits the road. The governments of Canada and the provinces, because they're separate heads of power, they're a shared sovereignty, must recognize each First Nation in their territory, beginning with that act of recognition. And there needs to be some formality to that, and that requires First Nations to come forward and define themselves and define and develop their nationhood in dialogue with Canada. That's the opportunity we have here, that we're all here to stay. Nobody's asking anybody to leave. We got to share and coexist. Let's recognize each other and develop that jurisdictional relationship. Let's split up lawmaking powers as we see fit. That's what treaty making is supposed to be about. First Nations are going to retain legislative authority over matters that are integral, that are essential to who we are and to maintaining who we are as a people. There's some that will maybe acknowledge Canada and BC, or Canada and the respective province will maintain. There's some will share, but we need to sort those out. But it begins with recognition. So let me just take a quick review of the Haida situation and my experience with that. You know, today when I look at that Haida Gwaii, I'm quite happy with progress we've made over the past 30 years, and that's mainly been through the will of our own people. Any federal lands, which is one protected area called Gwaii-Haanas, we have a nation-to-nation agreement. We make decisions with Canada 50-50. no, but if we don't agree, we fight over it. We have resolved every issue, and some of them I didn't think in the 22 years since we've signed that agreement, I didn't think we'd make it through as partners. We made it through with just because of that goodwill. We made it through every one of those agreements. 2 years ago, we raised a pole in Guayhanas at the Haida totem pole, celebrating 20 years of that relationship. It can be done. For the rest of the islands, working shoulder to shoulder with our neighbors and coastal First Nations, we've signed a reconciliation protocol with the government of BC where we make decisions, joint decision making over every square inch of the land mass of Haida Gwaii outside of the federal crown area. Every square inch of other lands we make decisions on zoning 50-50. Nothing happens in Haida Gwaii without our consent, without our approval. And that gives us time. It's not a panic anymore to resolve the title question. We BC can't do a damn thing without us. I have no problem with them. They're not an issue anymore. And in fact, when our nation 5 or 6 years ago went to the Supreme Court of Canada on the Haida, it was the tree farm license case, what became known as the Haida Consultation and Accommodation Decision. Our neighboring communities on Haida Gwaii came to the Supreme Court of Canada with us. They went and hired their own lawyer. They appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada and said, we choose to invest our future with our neighbors, the Haidas. We're here against you, Canada and BC. We're here to support the Haida Nation's claim because our future is intricately intertwined with theirs, and we're together with them. That's big progress. So how did we get there? And so the next step is just a matter of relationship building and time, and we'll sort out the lawmaking authority in due course. Not a panic right now, at least to me. 30 years ago, it wasn't so rosy. 30 years ago, they were threatening to cut the last tree on Haida Gwaii. They'd pretty well taken all the fish. They were spraying pesticides. Cancer was rampant. And then they were threatening to drill for oil and gas in our oceans. And this is when I came along, just out of school as I got elected president of the Haida Nation. And our elders were saying, my God, this situation is so serious. We can't do what we've been doing. For 100 years, we've been waiting for justice from the crown. And in the 100 years, nothing's changed. This just isn't working for us. We've got to do something else, because if they drill for oil and gas, that's the death knell. We might not survive as a people. Every generation of our nation, for hundreds of generations, for 15,000 years, has met one test. They've passed on our legacy to the next generation. They told us we may not if we let this happen. So they said, let's quit worrying about checks from Ottawa and Victoria. That didn't make us who we are. Let's face the fact that we are Haida. We are who we are because of the richness of our home. We are who we are because of our relationship to Haida Gwaii, the lands and oceans of our homelands. And what we need to do is to stand up as the living generation, accept our responsibility for stewardship, and protect her. That became, that was around the time you started too, Harold. That was a pretty hefty mandate. And that became our mandate as the young leaders of the Haida Nation. So, we'd go to Ottawa or Victoria and say, hello, we're the Haida Nation. And, who the hell's that? And what the hell? And I remember my first meeting with Minister McKnight. I come into Ottawa. We could only afford one ticket, so I came by myself, and our member of parliament, Jim Fulton, came to the meeting with me. So I say, Mr. McKnight, I'm Miles Richardson. I'm the president of the Haida Nation, and here's my list of issues, mostly land use issues. So Bill McKnight looks at me and sort of smirks and says, Mr. Richardson, I'm the Minister of Indian Affairs, not the Minister of the Haida Nation. I got up and left and never talked to him again. That was the nature of things. So we sat down and we said, okay, we need some legitimacy to our lawmaking. To make a long story short, we did two fundamental things. We drew up a constitution for our nation. We'd never had a written law. We took our oral tradition, which wasn't written, and we wrote it down and we framed it into a constitution where we identified who is a Haida, we identified our territory, we identified our worldview, we explained it, we identified our governing institutions, and a process for lawmaking. That was our constitution, very simple. And we got our people to authorize that as the fundamental law of our nation. And then the second thing we did is we sat down and we looked at Haida Gwaii and all the federal and provincial plans that had for it, and we made our own plan. We did a zoning land use plan for 100% of Haida Gwaii. And it was essentially a 6-point plan, 6 zones. That became, today, when you look at the federal provincial agreement, and we took that zoning plan and we legislated each zone section under our constitution. In 1981, we done? Give me 2 minutes. In 1981, you take one section of our land use plan, Dugoose Tribal Park. Guayhanas, we were fighting to protect. There was an area that hadn't been touched by the loggers. We drew a line around it and said, we're going to protect this. We're not asking anybody, we're telling you. If you go in there, we're going to fight you. So we took it to our House of Assembly, our legislative authority. We passed our first piece of modern Haida legislation. It was one sentence. Dugoose Tribal Park will remain in its natural state in perpetuity. That was our legislation. And so we sent letters to Ottawa and Victoria and said, you're not going there. But most importantly, we went out in a fleet of boats to the logging camp that was going to move in there. We set up feast tables down the middle of the logging road right outside their camp, and we invited them. Amazingly, they came. They ate with us. All their kids, the families came. We sat down and we said, this is Dugoose Tribal Park. It's Haida land and you're not welcome to, there'll be no logging there. We want to get along with you. To this day, they stayed out on their own will. That was 1981. Now we've legislated that provincially as to match the Haida legislation. Guayhanas, they decided to fight, and that's a whole nother story. We still protected it. They never cut one tree, and we had an agreement with Canada. And now in the agreements I told you about, the joint decision making and the Guayhanas agreement, everything we put into that plan 25 years ago has been confirmed and matched by federal and provincial legislation. Our Haida legislation, as simple as it was, proved superior to federal and provincial legislation. So anybody tells you it can't be done, don't believe them. All it takes is your will to do that. And I'd love to tell you more, but I'm sure the chairman's.
No, they're absolutely wonderful stories, and maybe in the questions you can answer some more about it. I mean, one of the keys to that story is recognition and just acting upon rights and the ability to actually impactfully build a system of government that is recognizable and is enforceable and is working. So we'll move to Chief Gugu. and Morley to talk a little bit about his thoughts on where the government of Canada should go, the Crown should go, and some of your experiences in rebuilding institutions of Indigenous governance.
Yes, thank you, Tim, and thanks for everybody having the opportunity for me to share my ideas on this. I've had a very long vision of trying to build a Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq government, and have stumbled across a lot of barriers, not more into government, but also within our own people. And I just want to be able to share some of those things so that you don't feel that you're isolated and that chief or counselor down the road is such an idiot that this plan could happen. It happens all across the Canada, right? You know, but there's some great ideas out there, but I find that we need to amplify the transparency and build the structure a lot more clearer so people can understand what they are taking as a result of the option of the Indian Act. And it was always scared and feared all these years. I remember a very good friend of mine, Chief Lawrence Paul, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know him. Never wanted to get out of the Indian Act and all that kind of stuff, you know. And he had a very good community, right? But at the same time, it offered safety. So you don't know what you were trading at. And that cultural shift even made our own people think, oh my God, I got to send my kid to a white school because they're never going to make it to anybody if we send them to the native schools. You know? And that was a sad reality. And more importantly, in the West, when I had the chance to take on the education portfolio, I saw schools ending at grade 3 to grade 6 to grade 8, and then astonished when I found out they moved away 75 to 100 kilometers away. You know? And then when we took over education in Nova Scotia as a self-government agreement, it wasn't like our top negotiating styles. Government wanted to download all these programs. We were only asking for post-secondary education. We wanted to lock it in because rumors were starting, and they continued to, that the government was going to give it to the Aboriginal Achievement Award Foundation and get it off their books and all that kind of stuff. And something went wrong in there and all that kind of stuff. But that was what we were hearing. So we wanted to say, no, we want our own self-government, sectorial government agreement. Block funding. Jane Stewart came back and said, why don't you guys take all education? And we were like, well, what will that mean? Well, we'll give you money for governance. We'll give you money for negotiations. We'll give you money for school replacement costs and all that kind of stuff. No capital money, though. So we had to be creative. All the capital cost that was built into schools that were there, the chiefs agreed to put all their money and build new schools instead. So that's how we started building new schools. And each 5 years, we showed our graduation going up higher and higher and higher. We also created a lot more Aboriginal teachers. So as we went on, we wanted to build the Mi'kmaq government. And I started it at 26, and I don't shut up about it at every chief meeting. And some chiefs tell me, oh, Morley, would you shut up about the Mi'kmaq government already? And in the next meeting, they'll be banging their head. What about our Mi'kmaq government, Morley? So I'm like, oh my God, yeah. I just say yes, yes. And when they say no about it, I just look away and just, you know. But I find, just an example, we've fallen in a pattern of programs and policies and false names of governance and nationhood and governments. And the first time I became chief, I had the chance to go to Phil Fontaine's community. And he had asked me, come to my community, chief. I was 24. And I went to him and he had an annual assembly. And the elders talked about what's going on there. And of all the things that was happening, I'm 24, I sat with a group of 8 elders. And when one elder told me, and I'll never forget these words, he said, who are you? I said, I'm First Nation from Nova Scotia. He says, you're wrong. I said, okay. I'm 24. I'm not going to argue with a 70-some-year-old in their territory, right? He says, you're Mi'kmaq, and I'm Dene. Canada has mislabeled us from day one. They called us Indians. They called us savages. They called us Aboriginals. They came back to Indians. Then they came up another word with Indigenous people. Then you know what? Everybody got pissed off, and somewhere we all got comfortable with First Nation people. Oh, yes, First Nation. And I live on a First Nation. So we've got caught in an identity that we didn't create. So then government sold that identity to Canadians. And while they sold that Canadian identity, they sold and stereotyped all our problems with the value systems and the principles, not realizing they're the same and not the same. And the ceremonies are different. And why we may have a governance system in Nova Scotia different than one it will be in BC and Nova Scotia, you know what? Europe is so much smaller. They have their own government systems that are different from each other. You know, Canada is so wide. We are and should have our own governance systems that are different. So when I hear governments talk today and say, I want to talk to you about nationhood. And I am very, very good friends with Jody, not as a justice minister at Morley Gugu, but as a regional chief, you know, just like chief and councils, you get your favorite councillor and you get your favorite chief. Well, Jody and I stuck together in a lot of things. And I was very proud of her to get the justice portfolio. And she had mentioned in one of the speeches at the AFN Annual Assembly, she said, I want to make sure I recognize your governments. I want to make sure I facilitate for us to be able to have the dialogue so that we can understand what nation to nation means. Because you go across 635 communities, the rich bands will say, I'm the nation. 50 kilometers down the road, poverty. Nope, they're not a nation. And if we want them to be a nation, sure as hell this band's not going to give us this money to make sure they take care of their fellow Cree, their Dene, their Mi'kmaq. So we've kind of developed a system which we have to try to figure out how can each Mi'kmaq, Cree, Dene, Ojibwe, and across the country address the housing issues. And I don't like, and I'm not offending or criticizing anyone, and I'll go in a debate anytime, not here, in a room somewhere, that if you give money to 19-year-olds, you have a leakage in your company. That leakage creates hardships. That leakage creates money to car dealerships, to you name it. And then our principle says, let's take care of our elders. But we don't have the political savvy or guts or strategy to tell, because we know what's going to happen. Hey, I get in, chief, you get your check back. Woo! It's a vote right there. So we have to be able to show that if you're going to have a pension at 55 and try to create an equal quality of life for our community members, why should a non-native guy be able to go retire at 55, 60, or 65 when our 55, 65, 60-year-old starts getting arthritis, stress, diabetes because he doesn't work anymore, because his physical body doesn't allow him to go be the carpenter and the carpenter boss he used to be, you know? So there's real gaps in our system, and we do have to split up into teams. I cannot, as regional chief, I cannot think my fellow chiefs. We have to break up into teams and bring those back to say, listen, this is the way we feel that we can narrow that gap. And what are the investment dollars that are going to be required? What are the policy changes that are going to be required? And most importantly, what is the legislation that's going to be required to ensure that the next government comes in doesn't just put it back to the status quo? And just coming here, last, I'm going to leave on this note. We also have to change our story. Canadians don't hear our story. We're too angry. Canadians say, oh, Indians, wow. Free cigarettes again, did they say they get? Oh no, free cars too. Free houses. Tax-free. Wow, if I was tax-free, God, I wouldn't be complaining. What more do they want? And then they turn the channel. Oh, look at them. They're at the protest already. That's their education about us. And then when we go on the news, we're angry. We're not sharing the story and the history for them to understand and get it, why there is not a quality of life. Government did a pretty damn bad job hiding that information. I say North Korea censors all other countries. Canada censored Canadians when it came down to education and residential schools. You know? And that wasn't right. But now people are starting to find out. So I'm very proud to be started of the Gord Downie and Chani Wenjack Legacy Room, and try to get that story and move all our other initiatives to get more people involved with what reconciliation is, because people don't know what reconciliation is. It's a big word. You asked me about that probably 15 years ago, I wouldn't have known what the hell reconciliation was. So imagine all our kids, right? And how do we make up things for people to be all equal in Canada? Some are very, very poor. Some are very doing all right. And I think that we really need to look at more strategies to reach out and inspire and motivate people to tap into their heart. I always say this, I apologize again. This is the last story, but I have to tell you one more last story. And promise this one will be, though. When I think we have arrogant people in every society, every country. But you guys, how many people, show of hands, remembered the refugee status and the little boy on the beach? Right? Very bad situation. Hearts of Canadians filled up. What happened? We filled up warehouses across this country. We worked together to give apartments because our hearts are big, but the stories are wrong. That was presented as a right story. 50 years, Chani story happened on a train tax. Nobody knew about it. Nobody did nothing about it. And if it wasn't for that Maclean's magazine and Mike Downey taking it to Gord Downey, still we wouldn't even know about it today. Right? So again, I ask us to sit down and reframe our story. Because if we want to be a better country, people got to reconcile and realize the truth, and in not an angry way, the truth and solutions on how we move forward together. So that's what I wanted to say, and I thank you for taking the time to listen to me.
Thank you, Chief Gugu. Reframing the story through reconciliation based on recognition is tied into what Miles was saying. So, Bob Ray.
Thanks very much. It's a real privilege to be here. And I'm going to start with a story of John Diefenbaker was giving a speech late one night in Prince Albert, and slowly but surely the audience started to leave the room. And by the time he finished his speech, there was one man left in the room. And finally, he sort of turned to the man. He said, "If you don't mind my asking, sir, why are you here?" He said, "Oh, I'm here to thank the guest speaker." So I don't know which one of you is going to be the last person in the room.
Probably Buddy. So.
Well, Buddy and I can keep talking because we've got a lot of stories to swap over the years. I wanted just to kind of make a couple of very brief points because I do want to get into the questions. The first one is that I think in order for the process to get stronger and better than it has been across the country, because it's very uneven across the country. There are areas of huge success and real progress in creating stronger, prouder, more successful governments and communities. And I can also tell you some stories about things that have where things just haven't moved. And we just haven't seen a lot of movement. And I think it's good to be here with these two gentlemen because they've been part of experiments that have really succeeded and established a whole new model. The Mi'kmaq education story is one of the great success stories of our country. And somebody was asking earlier about outcomes. It's important for everybody to understand the outcomes now in the Mi'kmaq school system are higher than they are in many, many other neighboring schools. And it's because of the success that has come from a plan, self-government, knowing how to go forward, having a goal, achieving the goal, moving on. And that's really what I want to start with. Don't ask the government to solve your problem. Don't ask the federal government and don't ask the provincial government. Why do we, how does a case get heard in the court? A case gets heard in the court because the Crown is on the other side. We talk a lot about how these great Supreme Court decisions since Calder in 1973, which was the first big decision. Well, let me just remind you, either the federal or the provincial government has been on the other side of every single case since 1973. So if you're waiting for the Crown to define self-government or define the relationship, you'll be waiting for a long time. The definition of the relationship and the definition of the goal has to come from within First Nations communities themselves. That's where it starts. And I think what's great about Miles' story is that that's what it's all about. Don't wait for the Crown to tell you what your jurisdiction is. Tell them what your jurisdiction is. Don't wait for the Crown to write your constitution. Write it yourselves. It has to come from within. And part of the challenge that we face is that and I make this observation, this may be a very career-shortening move because I'm still practicing Indigenous law. And you may just say, well, that's one guy I'm not going to go to. what I want to suggest is that from my observation the last several years, the internal divisions have been the killer. Even in terms of saying, Miles was saying, let's define our jurisdiction and our boundaries and then negotiate with the provincial government in British Columbia. Well, yes, but what's the biggest issue now in British Columbia? The divisions and the differences between neighboring nations. What is the boundary? What is the border? What do we do about areas where there's a difference of opinion as to whose traditional territory it is? And those are issues that can best be solved not by the Crown, either federal or provincial, but by and among the First Nations themselves. The second thing I want to suggest is, and it's been talked about, I just want to emphasize it from my perspective. Among the many bad things that happened in the 19th century, residential schools, which were an abomination, the way the Crown interpreted the treaty relationship, which it signed right across the country from Ontario through to eastern British Columbia, and the Indian Act, they were all based on the premise of racial superiority, of the fact that the only government that mattered was either the federal or the provincial government, but it was settler governments, either federal or provincial, that Indigenous communities were incapable of governing themselves, and that therefore the best we could do would be, in the case of the Indian Act, is create 634 sandlots across the country and say, you guys go play in that sandlot, we'll send you money every year, and that'll be your government. Without any regard to language, culture. I mean, even the treaties were signed. They mixed cultures and languages and peoples and nations, and then they divided them all up. So now, in the big struggle we have in coming out of this, it's my feeling anyway, is the need to create unity in the nation, for the nation to define itself, to reinvigorate language, to reinvigorate custom, to reinvigorate law, to reinvigorate all of the things that, we need to keep on reminding everybody about this, is they were there in 1604. They were there in 1200. They were there in 600. They've been there for thousands of years. And those governance and governing structures were destroyed systematically and deliberately by colonial governments. And we're in the middle of a process of a movement to self-government that is just as dramatic as the decolonization of Africa, the decolonization of Asia, which was the great world event of the 1940s and 50s and 1960s. And this is what the move to self-government is all about. Every government requires land, it requires jurisdiction that is recognized and respected, and it requires money so you can actually do something. Now, it's not that complicated to say it, but to actually do it is hard. And the one additional point I would make is that in talking about the Crown, please don't forget the provinces. The reality is, in Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba, and right across Northern Canada, the provinces, the government is the province. It's not the federal government. The federal government has a relationship because of the Indian Act and because of the Constitution of 1867. But it has interpreted that relationship in the narrowest of ways. More than half the First Nations population does not live on reserve. As soon as you leave the reserve to hunt, to fish, to engage in any traditional activity, to go to school outside the reserve, to go to college or to go to university, to live a life outside the reserve for a time, then to go back, you are in the jurisdiction of the province. The most powerful ministries in Ontario, Ministry of Natural Resources, Ministry of Mines, the Attorney General's Ministry. They are exercising what they see as the Crown's jurisdiction. And believe me, as somebody who was a first minister, they believe that it's their province. What is asserted to be the traditional territory of the First Nations is seen as a quaint assertion by the provincial crown. And it's only just now that those folks are saying, okay, let's talk. The federal government has announced its commitment to the UN Declaration. Name me one provincial government that has said, we're committed to UNDRIP. No, I'm sorry. There isn't one. There isn't one that said, we will undertake to make sure that our laws conform to the UN Declaration. Tim said, whispered in my ear, Alberta. Well, no, I was just saying, no, it's fine. Because the problem with Alberta is, Alberta's been very careful. Alberta has said to its ministers, please tell us how UNDRIP can be made to conform to Alberta and federal law. Well, that's not adopting UNDRIP. So we've got a long way to go. It's a real struggle. And I agree everything that's been said, Morley, about the stories that need to be told, how we need to explain to Canadians what this is all about. Because the real challenge we face politically is that most of the population of Canada is not Aboriginal. And they have to be persuaded. Well, in part, they have to be told by the courts what the law is, which is great if you can win. But they also have to be persuaded that the moves that are being made make more sense. And this is my last point. We talk a lot about Aboriginal governance and government. Let me tell you something. Non-Aboriginal governance and government is a mess. It's a mess. What sense does it make for the government based in Ottawa to be telling people who are living thousands of miles away how they should run their school system, or how they should get their health care, or how much they're allowed to get for this or that? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. You have people living here who know almost nothing about the conditions under which people are living in the places which they have the effective financial and legal control over. It's nuts. It's inefficient. It's wasteful. Hundreds, billions of dollars are wasted. We shouldn't be afraid to say that. We said we can actually spend this money more wisely, better, and more effectively than you can. Give us the money. And yes, as Mike DeGagne said earlier, give us the public servants. You're spending close to $1 billion a year on the bureaucracy here in Ottawa. That's a lot of money to be locked up. Policy work, rules work, creating all of the structures. That's money that could be put to good use in Northern Ontario and Northern Quebec and right across the country. It's right there. It could be done. But that's the agenda. And the final thing I want to say is it's so important for a political governance agenda to be created by First Nations people themselves, to be agreed upon, to be debated, and say, here's the agenda. And it's not just a vision, it's not just a dream, it's a set of practical steps that lead to self-government and make actual progress on the ground. And that's once that agenda is created, once it's shared, once it's in a little book, everybody can read it, here's our agenda, here's what we want to do, then it can get done. And you can say, are we getting there? And governments will say, what do you want? They say, it's right here. Here's what we want. Here's what we want to do. And it's so important that we get to that point of practicality in taking the human footsteps to better governance. And these two gentlemen have done it, but we've got to find a way to help other people to do it as well.
So we've got time for some questions, but first I'm just going to ask the other two panelists if they want to add anything or ask a question to either of the other panelists. I'll start with Morley just quickly.
I just wanted to mention, just along what he was talking about, Bob. I remember when Jody was announced as Justice Minister. I was at Clayton Park at a bank in a car parking lot, and I put the hotspot right on my iPhone and tried to get my iPad working. And my God, I was so proud of the indigenous drummers or native drummers or Indian or Aboriginal or they were drummers anyway. I think they were Inuit actually. The young, dark, beautiful regalia children. And while they were drumming, I was like, yes. And then I saw Jody, I'm like, again, yes. And anybody saw me in the car all by myself. I was like, yes, in the TD Bank outside. And then when I was like listening to it, and then overnight, just gives you an example of what we go through. Bennett starts talking. I am so glad here that the indigenous people of this land, we got switched from First Nation people overnight. And then we're now labeled, right? We were indigenous to First Nation and all that stuff. Could you imagine you wake up tomorrow and you guys are something else? Well, that's what we got to go through. So anyway, that's all I had to.
Thanks, Morley.
No, I just wanted to thank Bob for that good joke. I think I related it to it a little too much.
Okay. Before we get to that point in the agenda, questions or comments or observations about the role of the Crown, keeping in mind that I'll be mentioning it to the Crown tonight. Although
Sleeping on the couch.
but in all seriousness, you know, it's sorry.
But in the robe.
I just wanted to build on Miles' point or put it out there that around this nonpartisan discussion, because it was Brian Mulrooney that was across the table for the Section 35 talks, and it was Stephen Harper who apologized to residential school survivors. So I think it is really important, and I hadn't really thought about it in that way. But if we're talking about all of Canadians, but we're also talking about the Crown, it is not the Liberal Party of Canada or the Conservative government. We have to make sure that we remember that in these dialogues, because then the window doesn't close in 3 years.
Yeah, I would disagree entirely with not entirely with the idea that the window closes. We don't have much time. I'm agreeing with you. I don't think the world comes to an end in because of some partisan window. I really don't believe that. I just think that's not the way to think. I think the way to think is, what's our agenda? It's an agenda that surpasses the window of any government, federal or provincial. It's based on our timetable. It's based on our values. It's based on our view of what's going to happen. And we're not going to be dancing to anybody else's tune. We're going to be making it happen ourselves. And other governments are going to have to respond. No matter how, quote, progressive or reactionary they may be, they're going to have to respond to our concerns.
Maybe I'll make an observation on that too, because I know in terms of Jody's perspective on this and others, is that for sure it has to be nonpartisan. And for any of us that were involved in some of those legislative initiatives that Harold talked about earlier, many of them are done under conservative governments. In fact, some of the strongest advancements that have been made in opening doors and pushing this agenda forward have been made under conservative governments. So ultimately, for this to survive, it has to be a Canadian project and a project that's based fundamentally in the principles that we all share in terms of Canadians and has been set by the courts and is told by this document. I mean, this gives you a framework for thinking about the issues. It's a way, and with the United Nations Declaration, it's a way to look at the world, not to throw it on the floor. But and so I think that's an important point. So I think we should reflect on that. Other comments, Mr. Kella?
The Liberal government would not use its majority to pass Indian legislation.
Well, I've joined 2 political parties. I'm not going to join a third one.
You never know. There might be an Indigenous political party at some
Well,
point that might accept the, the odd non-Indigenous person. So, question in the back.
Hi. So along the lines of what you've been talking about, I think the TRC has some really good ideas about how to educate the next generation of Canadians about what all of this means. But that means we have to wait for my kids to be old enough to start lobbying their government. So I'd be interested in your views on what we can do now to start telling the right kind of story and get real Canadians involved and invested in these issues.
I'd like to answer that.
Well, you just one
Yeah,
one
yeah,
thought. One thought I had is just today, just listening to people, reminded about how we're getting much better education in the schools. One thing we could ask every government as it's sworn in is let's have a 2-day, 3-day retreat where the cabinet members, every single cabinet member, or every MP, every legislator has to listen and learn to the story of the First Nations people in their province or in their country. And just to do it as a formal thing, just say this has to be done. You need training. You need to be trained. You need to learn and make it happen. We're starting to do it in law schools. Well, we don't have to wait for the people in law school to become Prime Minister of Canada for it to happen. We can just say, let's just do it here. And you know what? Don't even wait for them to say yes or no. Set up the school, set up the program, and say we're inviting MPs to come, and we would like the Premier or the Prime Minister to tell his MPs and MPPs they have to turn up. I bet you they would.
Buddy, and then Morley.
So I think that's a really good question is how do we tell those stories positively? I think really importantly is just be who we say we are. That's essential. And, we don't our cultures are beautiful. Our cultures are some of the most beautiful and sustaining in this world. And we don't have to be cranky about defending them, getting out there. We can express it in the beauty that they are. And Bob's point's really well taken. Whenever we do something outside of the status quo, the Crown's in court with us. We've got to find from being who we are and standing up for ourselves, find our allies and do it in common and tell those stories. People will hear, there's a common, everywhere I go now across this country, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and some of the places you wouldn't have heard 10 years ago, everybody recognizes traditional territory. Everybody in just normal Rotary clubs and stuff, people stand up and recognize that. I remember when the Standing Committee on Environment came to Haida Gwaii this summer, the local MP stood up and said, I'm proudly from the Tunaha Nation. The Haidas appreciated that. It gave them a sense of who this person was. Anyway, that's a potential right across this country, and just stand up and tell our stories in a however we do that, and be proud of it. People want to hear. They'll acknowledge traditional territory. That's a protocol they've come to know. Then they'd like to know more about who these people are. We got to tell them. Nobody else should be.
Morley, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah. I think a couple things that we all have to understand, because children are becoming a little bit confused. We have teepees in East Coast, right? And we're supposed to have wigwams, right? I had an elder Facebook criticize me one day. How dare you put a teepee on? I inboxed her and I said, how dare you criticize me for trying? Right? And I said, anytime you want to make a comment, please inbox me, right? But our kids, we lost it for a while. That's the reality. Our generation here had lost it for a while, right? And there's a certain group that never lost it and really were, but majority of us. So we have to try to really invest into those knowledge systems. What it is the Mi'kmaq? What is the Mohawk? What is the Dene, the Cree, the Ojibwe, and all across the country? Because this is about culture, language, and this country is about diversity. And we cannot just continue to be diversifying and celebrating new immigrants that come in, which we've been all about peace and friendship, you know? But there's 1 million immigrants that come roughly in the next 4 years, 250,000. So we have 1 million people that are just not brainwashed totally anyway, right? So at least we can try to teach them, what they ran away from. We're on the steps of actually trying to fix here, right? But I really would like each region to take it on its own, because elders are now starting to self-identify themselves elders. I'm 47, but I am really tough looking and I have white hair. You should be calling me elder, right? So we have to have communities really kind of come up with those terms, not just for us or try to pick on each other, but it's for the kids' value systems, right? To be reinstated in our cultures. And that may take a while, but I think we should put a proposal into Minister Jolie's office about that. So I know that's my thought.
Actually, on that about the new immigrants or new people taking the citizenship oath, there is going to be a clause now or a statement in there about recognizing and honoring the treaties. So which will mean there's teaching about them. At this point, that's what it's in there. Yeah, no, I know that, but it says treaties, so I hear you loud and clear. So.
That's the problem.
That's the problem. Actually, so on that point, it's a question. We probably don't have time for people to think about it or ask questions about it. Maybe I'll ask it to the panel if there's other questions here. Okay, one here about what is there a different approach or policy? Is there a different approach or policy whether or not you have a pre-Confederation treaty or historical treaty or unextinguished Aboriginal title? Should the Crown be taking a different perspective of recognition depending upon whether or not what time you made some agreement with the Crown? I mean, I don't have an answer. That's just it's a question because we've got pre-Confederation, we've got post-Confederation treaties, numbered treaties, and we have nations with unextinguished Aboriginal title. So the question here from the.
I just want to add. I think we're going to have to, because I talked to the youth about this. I think we're going to have to create what the base of our tribes and their regalia and all that kind of stuff, but also not limit them to boring each other's styles to make their beautiful regalia, right? Because we used to borrow anyway, right?
Yeah.
But now because we have social media and can ship stuff to each other, right? Those regalias now have totally become different, right? But it's the principle of the thing that I love is that they're proud of wearing it, and that's what's most impressive for me.
Scott?
Just building on the last question.
It is.
I guess more to you, Regional Chief Gugu. The question of building allies. I mean, I know that you're short of resources, and the Assembly of First Nations short of resources. Lots of activity now, and it'll gradually go into bilateral discussions, and then eventually, if we're lucky, something significant will emerge where you need the support of Canadians to help tell the story, to help dialogue about it. But I seldom see that effort to build allies, to reach out and identify allies that can help you, support you when you need it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, can I answer that? This year when we went into National Chiefs discussions and planning on the new year after the Liberal government came in, he approached each and every one of us. What kind of portfolio would you be interested in? I took TRC calls to action because Marie Wilson had asked me, because I was always advocating for them when we were in the meeting, right? And I was like, iffy, I'm not a residential school survivor and all that. What was the backlash? But you know what? I didn't really care because I was speaking up for her and she recognized it. And I was very proud that she asked the national chief, could he at least do it? And I said, well, if people complain, I'll deal with it then, but I'll also justify I'll be there for them when they need something. And when it came down to language, culture, and arts, there is no such thing as a portfolio, language, culture, and arts, right? Language, we were starting to do it in Mi'kmaq. I speak Mi'kmaq as my first language. Our culture, again, I was really fascinated by the fact that I want to bring my pipe carriers, I want to bring all my traditional people in Nova Scotia in a workshop and create that as a template and maybe share that to go across the country, because we have some really strong personalities that feel it's their way, and it's making our kids confused, right? What is the right way? You know? So I'm asking hopefully the pipe carriers to do a 3-4 day session to please, you know, your teachings and your cooperation and consensus here is for the benefit of also our children, you know, that do want to learn, you know? And so those are the two initiatives that we wanted to pursue. I'm also have to throw this a bragging on this one now. I work with the Halifax Waterfront Corporation, and you'll hear an announcement in 2 weeks' time. The tall ships are coming to Halifax as part of 150 celebrations. I've worked with the Waterfront Corporation to put 45 youth from Halifax to France on the leg to learn leadership and mentorship training. What I'm also trying to add on to that is that I will have TV video recording so that they can call home, and that all our Aboriginal kids will get to see them and all that. I tried to give everybody total across in December equal spots, but the National Council didn't bite into it. So I told Halifax Waterfront Corporation, I'm only comfortable to do Atlantic Canada, but I'll include 1 seat per province. And it's Sail Training International that does it, and it was nominated one of the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prizes. So I've got $25,000 from MK, $50,000 from Waterfront Corporation, and other organizations, but they're all going to get paid $650 a week while they do the cross Atlantic journey, and then I'm going to take them to Vimy Ridge when we get there. And the coolest part I like about this is that when they get their acceptance letters, they're going to get their top of the line outfits with their bags when they arrived home. When they open it, their equipment will be in there. Right, so it's going to be a big showstopper and all that stuff. So we're working on stuff, and that's no portfolio money yet. So wait till I have some portfolio money.
Buddy, did you want to just talk a little bit about alliances too, or alliances with the? Because you've
When Scott asked that question, the thing that comes to my mind is the importance, and we need to put more effort into it, and is building real, endearing alliances amongst ourselves as Indigenous people. I think to me that's the important part, and I think relations with others comes from that. I think that's an offshoot of that. And I'm sitting here thinking of that. We had one of these IOG sessions a couple of years ago, and the Indian Affairs deputy was here, and he was just, it was madder than hell about overlaps, especially in BC. And You know, it's a matter of First Nation definition that we've got so used to reacting, we haven't been proactive in defining our overlaps and building alliances with our neighbors in a good way. You know, people say that my people, the Haidas, don't have overlaps. We had a ocean overlap over ocean territories with our Heiltsuk neighbors to the east, and it was one of the most beautiful things that I've witnessed. And I've been to 2 potlatches so far to deal with that. And our chiefs got together. Harvey Humchit, who's here today, is one of the Heiltsuk chiefs who got together with the Haida chiefs, and they just talked about history. Why are we still fighting over this area? 160 years ago, our people had been warring, killing each other over the same dispute. And the chiefs then got together and said, this is crazy. They made a treaty 160 years ago. So it came up again in terms of negotiations with Canada and dealing with oil and gas and all that. And again, our chiefs in their wisdom got together and said, we know who each other are. We know who Heiltsuk are. We know who Haida are. We know our territories. And this line here is not a line of separation. It's a line of joining. And you know what? Our kids took that right to heart. And it's building the future, and it's building those alliances amongst coastal First Nations. And you know what? The neighbors see that. Our neighbors in the non-Indigenous communities see that and respect that and start listening to each of our stories. And I don't know, it's just, Marilyn, it's one of the best things I've seen on that front in the last, in my lifetime anyway. It can be done, is all I'm saying. But it takes a will, it takes calling on goodness in you instead of, everybody wants to fight.
Okay, we're just finishing up here, just about past time. But is there any last burning question that's out there for this panel?
Remember, he's talking to the Justice Minister tonight.
Does anyone from the panel want to have closing words?
I just had one thing I wanted to say. That is, I think that we do have to deal with the inequities that have been created by a range of very different government policies over a long period of time. The federal government has taken the position after the Calder decision in 1973 and Mr. Trudeau's vision of the white paper was knocked out of the park. They said, okay, we'll sit down now and we'll negotiate with those bands and those nations, didn't use the word nation at that time, those communities that have not signed treaties. So this has given rise over the last 40 years to a whole range of self-government agreements and a whole transformation of governance in northern Canada, to the Nisga'a Treaty and a whole bunch of other things that have happened. And the one part of the country, and James Bay, of course, and now a big 25-year negotiation in Labrador for the Innu in Quebec, the one part of the country that has had no negotiations on self-government, has had no devolution, nothing at all, are the people that signed treaties before. And so you've got to ask yourself a question. Why would we punish the people who went along with the treaty proposals in the 19th century and frankly ended up getting nothing in return, like nothing, $5 a year? And you'd have to ask yourself, you look at the variation in what has happened, you got to say there's some inequities there that have to be addressed, and there's some greater understanding that needs to be reached. Now, the pressure for that change is coming from within the First Nations themselves. And the interpretation of the treaty that has long been buried inside a lot of First Nations people is now starting to come out and saying, We never gave up our land. Why would we give up our land? What do you mean we gave up our land? It's not our land to give up. It belongs to the Creator. So why would you think that the deal was you give us the land and we'll take care of you, whatever the hell that means? Well, then they sent them to residential schools and they did everything else. So we got to deal with those injustices, but we deal with it in a way that looks forward, that creates a forward-looking agenda that says, okay, how do we renew this relationship? Because it's gotten off to so many false starts and so many bad beginnings. And that's why I come back to my point. The definition of how to start has to come from within. It's not going to come from Ottawa, and it's not going to come from a provincial capital. With great respect, it's not even going to come from any one minister. It's going to come from within the First Nations. And I think that's where it starts.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And just, the
Applaud, please. I
please,
haven't heard
he needs
anything
he hasn't had any applaud yet, so. He's a politician, so I'm just joking. Retired, recovering politician. But kind of restate that point a little bit, because it's actually a critical point. If you start from the perspective of recognition, that you recognize Indigenous nations, then does it really matter whether or not you made an agreement with the Crown pre-contact? Thank you, Gwen. Does it matter? Was it pre-Confederation treaty, historical treaty, or modern treaty, or unextinguished Aboriginal title? If you start from the premise, which is why this last point about rebuilding Indigenous nations and knowing where you come from, and it can't come from the government or the provincial government or from one minister. It has to come from the Indigenous nations in order to say, this is the nation, this is how we're organized, and this is how we want to deal with the Crown. And it really shouldn't matter whether or not it's pre-Confederation treaty or post-Confederation number treaty or unextinguished Aboriginal title, simply by fate of history, when someone said, hey, I'd like to come to your land and take it from you, right?
So Tim, when the Crown comes to each First Nation, as you see yourself across this country, and say, I'm recognizing you, you have to be prepared to say, in terms of nationhood, this is who I am. That's absolutely essential. If you just say, oh, I'm not anyway, you get the point. I don't need to.
Thank you very much. Great panel. Thank you, guys.
Well done, Tim.
Miles, can you actually stay up? We're just going to do the closing now. We're going to do the closing. Closing remarks. No. Okay. Also, I'd like to ask Elder Gordon Williams to come up too as well.
Miles, you blew it. Well, thanks everybody. I think it's been a tremendous day and a half, and the first thing I want to do is thank the tremendous speakers who have given so freely of their time and their wisdom and their experience over the last day and a half. Because without them, what would this jam-packed day and a half have been? There are many exercises of this nature and many discussions of this nature playing out across the country, but I have to say, and I don't think I'm overly biased, that the last day and a half has been jam-packed with so much that capturing it all in a report is going to be an intriguing piece of work. Saying that, I have to also thank the staff, the IOG, that made this happen, Barry and Dan, and in particular Tim and Harmony. Marcia, who put together that paper for us as an attempt to sort of summarize these very important issues, and I, like Scott, think this is a tremendous paper. I also want to thank two of the greatest volunteers the world ever had, Marion Lefebvre and Scott Serson, who give tirelessly of their time, and I mean as volunteers, to all of this work because they believe so much in these views. I don't know if Miles is going to get up and speak or not, because he is representing, besides everything else he's done in the last day and a half, Canadians for a New Partnership. So I'm going to thank them as well, because without their support, we wouldn't be here either. And now let me say a few words about what I've observed over the last day and a half. You know, I'm a recovering public servant, and I've spent my entire life, just about, showing respect for those laws, which sometimes are dead wrong and are not in keeping with the Constitution. Nevertheless, it was often my job to administer them when I couldn't change them or try to modernize them. So at the IOG, I think we're inspired to keep working in this area because making our Canada whole is an important part of what makes us tick every day. It's about living in a country that's great for all of us, with respect for the Constitution, not just for the laws, which sometimes don't respect the Constitution. Making room for strong legal frameworks that allow for strong institutions, evolving and living, adapting to a modern context, building on traditions for mutual respect that recognize the important things that have been talked about here over the last day and a half: language, culture, identity, custom, traditional governance models that actually do build resilience and social cohesion. As a country, we're all made stronger if we make each other stronger, and believe it or not, we're all made weaker if we make each other weaker. The rest of us have to keep up, the rest of us who aren't part of First Nations or Indigenous Canada, Métis and Inuit, have to keep up that respectful dialogue. We have to keep educating each other about the context that got us here to where we are, and the fact that in some of these areas we must change. Yes, in your communities, you have to know what you're looking for in terms of change, but we have to be part of making that change. There's no respect without understanding, and there's no understanding without dialogue. And for those of us at the IOG, I have to tell you, we work by three principles, or three sets of, call them as you will, characteristics of governance, because this is about the characteristics of a nation-nation relationship. And if we're talking about a shared future, let me just go over those three. Who makes decisions? How are decisions made? And how do we render account? Well, if we're talking about a shared future, who makes decisions? The short answer is together. That's a complicated series of togetherness there, but let's start there. How are decisions made? With respect for each other, after being completely informed about what we're being asked to decide, and obviously together. And thirdly, how do we render account? Well, the short answer is to each other. Now, those principles apply regardless of what level of government we're talking about, whether we're talking about the nation, whether we're talking about provinces, whether we're talking about cities, whether we're talking about First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. If rule of law matters, then how we live together has got to be reflected in our laws at all levels for our joint future. If our laws, our institutions, our policies, our fiscal arrangements, and our programs don't reflect this reality, then we fall short. And we know that part of the Crown, known as the Attorney General for Canada and the Minister of Justice, has been asked as part of her new mandate to take on a review of some of these laws. There is an urgency to it. Building your and our diversity into Canada's present and future is one of the things that's supposed to be the greatest strengths about Canada. So I go back to the words of Elder William yesterday before he closes the day for us. He talked about, in his prayer, a good heart, good spirit, and good minds will help us resolve many things. So I don't know if Myles is going to say a few words, but I will say that on behalf of the IOG, thank you. On behalf of the IOG and on behalf of Myles and Canadians for a New Partnership, because it is his nightmare that he's the last one in the room, and on behalf of Canadians for a New Partnership, we hope, we hope very much to see you all in Vancouver, hopefully at the end of April, in what we're going to tackle next, which is the area of jurisdiction. So remember, we're doing 5 of these. This has been the first one. Nation building and nation rebuilding. Jurisdiction is our next one. Intergovernment fiscal relations will be the third one in Toronto. And collective governance and wealth creation will be in Halifax. And then finally, we'll come back and wrap it all up in one big shebang sometime in September back here in Ottawa. So on behalf of all of us, we hope to see you in Vancouver. Thank you very much for having been here for the last day and a half. Thanks to our great speakers. And Elder, I'll turn it over to you for our final prayer. Thank you.
I find it fascinating in many ways. Uh, I will be giving the prayer. And I don't know how many of you know who I really am. You know, uh, I graduated from University of Manitoba, graduated from McGill, was a missionary in Taiwan, uh, traveled extensively in Canada and the United States, doing all kinds of crazy things, speeches. But my first love, which got me to where I am, which people don't know, which is fantastic, is I sang and played the guitar to get myself through university. Yeah. And I put it away now. It did its task, and I'm happy I don't have to do that anymore. But back in the late 50s, early 60s, when I was doing it and going through university, I had back then, which I think was a relative fortune, I used to get $400 an hour. Yeah. So that carried me through. But in between all that stuff, you couldn't just sing and play and sing and play and sing and play. You had to tell jokes. You had to have stories. You had to have all kinds of stuff in order to keep an audience for an hour. I feel that if you hold an audience for 20 minutes, you are fantastic. You know, anything more than 20 minutes, and I know that because I've also been a minister for the last 50 years, and I see many of my congregation nodding off every once in a while. And by then, you got to stop. You can only say certain things long enough before people get to the point where time to go to sleep. Anyway, I've had many different careers over the years, and was a minister, was a missionary, was an entertainer, was all different things. But each one of them served a purpose at the time I was doing it. You don't do something just like that. You have to have a reason to do it. And all of those career changes has made me what I am. Sometimes I wonder whether I'm a good facsimile of it or a very poor replica, because at times you find that you want to tell stories about interesting events in your life, and they may not be that exciting. So after a number of years of doing speaking and preaching and singing and all this other stuff, I decided that, you could have one really good speech, but that wears out after a while too. So I don't go back to any speeches I've done before, because if you don't have new material, you become old news. Okay? And the worst thing you want to be is old news. But it's been a pleasure being here with you, listening to the different people, looking at these auspicious people here in the front 4 chairs. Each one with their own gifts and ability to share. We need to take time off every once in a while. And I say this with a great conviction. Every one of us has a gift. It may not be to speak, it may not be to sing, it may not, but you have a gift. And the thing is, how do you use that gift? When do you use it? You have to take an introspect look at yourself and begin to think, what have I done today that makes me unique? Too many of us, in the course of our walking step by step on this earth, we don't give thanks for what we have. We don't really share from within. In many instances, we do it very plastically. It doesn't do very much. So if I leave anything with you, I would say, be real. Be real when you meet everybody. Because everybody you meet is important. If you don't see them as important, then it's a reflection upon you in terms of how you see yourself. Enough preaching, eh?